My name is Hugh Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities here at UM. And I'll just start with a couple of procedural matters and announcements before turning it over to the introducer. First of all, for those of you who are interested in buying the book that will be discussed this evening, we'll be putting a link in the chat in a bit. And I'll also note that we'll be holding a question and answer period at the end. If you are interested in asking a question, please put it in our Q&A button. You can just go down to the bottom, hover, click on the Q&A, and I'll be curating and reading the questions at the end. As I noted, this is the last of our book talks this academic year, but we do have one more event coming up, and that will be on Tuesday, April 27th at 7 in the evening. And it will be a presentation by Martha Jones, who is a prominent historian at Johns Hopkins University. And she'll be talking about what if Black women have always been the vanguard of voting rights. I'll also note for the undergraduates who have joined us as part of the whole Inquiring Minds, if you're planning on using tonight's attendance towards the Inquiring Minds Challenge, be sure to take a screenshot that shows your name as a participant and save this image, as you'll need to include it with your submission form, which is due April 30th. Details are on our Inquiring Minds page, and we'll include that link in the chat as well. Okay, at this point, I'll turn it over to this evening's introducer, Yolanda Martinez San Miguel, who is chair of the Modern Languages and Literatures Department. So thank you, Yolanda.
Thank you, Hugh. So I'm honored to introduce tonight my colleague Logan Connors, Associate Professor and Associate Chair of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Miami. Dr. Connors arrived at UM as Associate Professor in 2016 after teaching at Bucknell University and the Université Paris-Sorbonne as a visiting professor. His research focuses on early modern studies, specifically 17th and 18th century literature and culture, French and Francophone drama, and performance studies. His first monograph, Dramatic Battles in 18th Century France, published in 2012 by Oxford University, is a study about the debates between French philosophers and counter-Enlightenment intellectuals on Palissot's Les Philosophes and L'Écossaise by Voltaire. He also published a critical edition of Pierre-Laurent de Bellois' Les Sièges de Calais during academic year 2019 to 2020. He was an invited research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Lyon, France, where he started a new project on the diverse relationships between theater and military in France and its colonies from 1650 to 1815. Dr. Connors is also the author of multiple articles on discursive analysis of French and Francophone performance and theater from the 17th and 18th century that have been published in some of the best journals in European early modern and Enlightenment studies, such as Restoration and 18th century theater research and 18th century fiction, as well as top literary and cultural studies journals such as French Forum, the French Review, and PMLA. His academic reputation is further reflected through his role as a series editor for Saint Francophone, studies in French and Francophone theater at Bucknell University Press, and his very active presence as a reviewer for journals such as Philological Quarterly, French Studies, Modern Language Review, New Perspectives on the 18th Century and French Studies, as well as prestigious presses like Modern Language Association, Cambridge, and Routledge. At UM, he has been the director of undergraduate studies for several years, and in 2018, he founded our Study Abroad program, U Paris. This program has had a very positive impact on our French majors and minors who are transformed by the experience of pursuing their education in an international setting, as well as students from other schools that joined the program. So enough about Dr. Connors. Let me share a few words about my colleague, Logan. It is simply a joy to be Logan's colleague. He's a dedicated teacher and a wonderful advisor. He's up very early, always willing to engage in conversations about how to improve MLL language and literature programs, always willing to volunteer ideas to solve any glitches. He's a seasoned multitasker, be it attending 2 conferences via Zoom at the same time, or by watching in 2 screens our Zoom meetings and Major League Baseball while taking the minutes for the meeting and keeping track of the score. He has a very subtle but definitive sense of humor. He's a fan of Elise, Marie, and Josephine, and oftentimes he's the head, right, and left hands of our department, as well as the heart of our French section. I'm also happy to report that after being with us for 5 years, he has finally seen the light, and it is rumored that he's becoming a Caribbeanist, joining an area of strength in our department, but from his unique angle as a specialist in 17th and 18th century Francophone literatures and cultures. Today, he will be presenting his second book project entitled The Emergence of a Theatrical Science of Mind in France, 1660 to 1740, that was published in 2020 in the Studies in Enlightenment series at Oxford University Press. This second book highlights a radical departure among 18th century critics from traditional discussions of dramatic poetry and its classical rules to a new relational discourse on the emotional power of theatrical performance. So I'm honored to represent the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures and the University of Miami in the celebration of this major accomplishment of a very dear colleague and friend. So congratulations, Logan.
Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you so much. Not just for that introduction, but I think a lot of times people ask me, what is this book really about? And it's when a bunch of people thought through difficult emotional moments and tried to get something out of them that was beneficial. And I think that you have shown us how to do that over the past year. It's been a very difficult year to be someone in your role, and you've done it with grace and intelligence and dignity. And I think that that's really important. I'd also like to thank, of course, Oni and Meg and Hugh from the Center for the Humanities for organizing not only my event, but all of these events where I know personally I've learned so much. And I would like to also thank actually my former department chair, Lillian Manzour, who has also been very instrumental in supporting this project in many different ways, and really all of my colleagues in modern languages and literatures. Some of us study very different things, but we find a lot of common ground, in our commitment to each other's work and our commitment to making sure that our students can do things at a high level in multiple languages. And I think that that's really important. Okay, and thank you all for being here. I know it's 8 o'clock. You didn't sign up necessarily for hearing about the 17th and 18th century in France. Maybe you did, even better, but I'm gonna get right to it. I'm gonna share my screen. And I don't really have a written presentation as such, but I have just a PowerPoint just to keep me on the rails a little bit. And I really I'll try not to speak for more than 30 minutes. I wanna respect your time and also leave some time for questions. So what I'd like to do tonight is show you a bit of the path to my book, so some of where these ideas came from, some of the main claims and the most important arguments in the book. I'll show you the table of contents and show how the different chapters are organized and give you a little idea of what I'm trying to do in those different chapters. And then I'd like to show you some of my, the stuff that I work on. And I'm gonna show you a couple of the primary sources in translation, of course, from that chapter, which is my chapter 1, which really details all the horrible things that have been said about theater in 17th century France. And then I'll give you a brief description of the second half of my book, just as my conclusion. Okay, here we go. So the path to my book. So those of you who know some of my previous work, my first book, as Yolanda mentioned tonight, was on the theatrical arm of a very vociferous debate between philosophes and anti-philosophes. So if you want to call them members of the Enlightenment and members of the counter-Enlightenment, people like Voltaire, Denis Diderot, and to a certain extent Rousseau, and then their detractors on the other side. And this battle was very fierce in the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, as France moved to the revolution. And what really interested me in this project were particular creative processes. So that could be new ways of doing theater, new ways of spectating, new ways of critiquing theater, new ways of judging what it meant to produce good theater that occurred in these few years before the French Revolution. One of the plays I worked on in that project Le Siège de Calais, I wrote a critical edition of that. And I'm not going to go into that project in any detail, but I'll just say that one thing that interested me from that project was the notion of patriotism. And so it's supposed to be France's first national tragedy. And the idea of patriotism in a pre-revolutionary context, the historiography of patriotism often links it to the revolution. So what does it mean in a monarchy, and what does it mean in a pre-revolutionary context? And I ultimately got interested in the idea of patriotism as an emotion, as a particular type of emotion with a particular direction and relationship with subjects and power in the 1760s and 1770s. And I was really interested in this project on emotion and theater. I started thinking about the different ways theories of emotion and theories of theatrical performance operated in the 18th century. And I got involved in a wonderful grant at Paris-Sorbonne. It was one of those grants that seems like only they can get at European institutions, where they had a ton of money to write about and think about all the horrible things that people have said about theater. La haine du théâtre, the hatred of theater. You know, whether it's ancient Greece, contemporary Japan, the US in the 19th century, they really had everything covered. And I was on a particular branch of that focused on the years 1500 to about 1900 in Europe. And I was able to write, to focus on, you know, what about anti-theatricality, what about theater phobia was so important, and really seized on to that emotional moment of spectating, which bothered theaterphobes, people who were against theater so much. And so I wrote an introduction to and edited a double issue of restoration in 18th century theater research, which was totally devoted to anti-theatrical discourses in Europe. And so I was able to learn more about the situation, of course, in France, but also discover similarities and differences with German-speaking countries, lands in Italy and England, a little bit in Spain as well. And so from all these different experiences, polemics, emotion, anti-theatricality, came my dancing skeletons here. And so what I think this book, sort of the main claims here, is that it sits at the crossroads. It sits at the crossroads of a few different disciplines, such as French literary studies. I engage with the emergence or the popularization of specific literary and dramatic genres that came into fruition in this period. Things like philosophical tragedy, heroic comedy, la comédie larmoyante, or tearful comedy, which we'll see in a second. So there's a real engagement with that field. I also think it's important for theater studies. And so one thing that I'm looking at is reconstituting these plays in their performance environments. And so I have a chapter that takes a look at that to question what has been said about the emotional regime of some of these disciplines. And then, of course, cultural history. So various branches of cultural history, the history of polemics. So my first book, again, was on that polemic during what's often called the High Enlightenment, between counter-Enlightenment and Enlightenment playwrights and polemicists. This book deals with two very different polemics in an earlier period. The great theaterphobia scare at the end of the 17th century, which we'll look at in a second, and the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, a debate over what kind of literature was going to be best and how to evaluate literature in 17th and 18th century France. And also cultural history, a subfield of cultural history, the history of emotion, looking at particular emotions in specific time and places and their manifestations. So I think what this is a concise relational history of French theater. So it's not a book about how, like, tragedy in the 17th century became something different in the 18th century. It is a book about the way people conceptualize theater's effects and how theater related to different people. So how theater hurts people, how theater helps people, how theater makes people better people, or whatever that means in this context, but how theater teaches us more about ourselves, teaches us more about others, about our emotions, about the emotions of others. So I think that's what this book really is. I think this book is unique as well because it combines theater phobic, so very anti-theater discourses and theaterphilic. So people who are writing about how wonderful theater is and how actually theater is better than philosophical writing or other types of writing in exploring the nature of humankind. And so ultimately what I argue is that there was an emergence of a theatrical science of man. And I thought I would just read 2 sentences from my introduction because I can probably say it better than I can wing it here. Okay, so I say at the heart of what I call the early Enlightenment's theatrical science of man is a multifaceted reassessment of human emotion, theatrical performance, and the role of theater in French society. Through a diverse cast of characters, I construct a gradual and at times stunted narrative of increasing complexity, but with a persistent emphasis on investigating human nature through the emotions in theories of theatrical performance and dramatic literature. And so I think that this book is reevaluates some disciplinary sources. So in a subfield of the history of emotions, when it engages with literature, let's say, it tends to favor ego documents and epistolary and journals, novels too, making sure that theater plays a firm role in that history of emotions for the 18th century. This book actually, was launched by just reading a debate that was in the journal Critical Inquiry, and I think it was in 2010 or maybe 2011, where it was a debate between affect theorists and people who had a more, if you want to say, cognitive approach to the emotions. And I read that debate and was very interested in it and saw parallels to some of these early modern texts and differences, of course, as well. And so what I do in my book also, especially in the introduction to some of the chapters, is talk about that debate a little bit and then bring it back to the 17th and the 18th century. And then lastly, reevaluating sources in theater and performance studies. Not all disciplines incorporate in its genealogy, into its sort of origin story, discourses that were meant to destroy, annihilate, and kill it. And so I argue that theaterphobia actually had some interesting sort of origins to transformative theories of performance that will be shed in a more positive light and that will become very important to certain strands of theater and performance studies. All right, so this is the way I organize my book. So my book is organized into an introduction and 6 chapters and a conclusion. My first chapter is my big theater phobia chapter. I lay out all these different arguments that were made against the theater in 17th century France, and in mostly religious writing on theater. What I seize upon, which is prevalent in so much theaterphobic writing, is the emotional act related to theater. The emotional act of acting, of course, of writing plays, but most of all of spectating, and how dangerous, how transformative in such a bad way that feeling, that experience really was. In chapter 2, I talk about a switch. So an author, Jean-Baptiste Dubos, who agrees, he's a fundamentally pro-theater guy, but he agrees with theaterphobes that the emotional experience of theater going and of witnessing performance is the sort of raison d'etre, the essence of theater. But what he's going to do is change the notion of the mechanisms and really everything about what that emotional experience really is. Chapter 3, I talk about a ramping up of that effort. And so what's going on here is these theorists are adding layers and phases and sequences to now what is both a very mindful and a very emotional and not necessarily in any way separated theatrical experience. So chapters 1, 2, and 3 are all about theory, and chapters 4, 5, and 6 are all about theater. And so chapter 4, I stick with the same author, an author, Udal Dadamat, and I move from his theory to his theater and an analysis of how he stages a lot of these theories of emotion in his tragic corpus. In chapter 5, I move to probably the only author you might recognize on this page, a very canonical author, Marivaux, And actually one of the French comedic authors who's performed the most in the United States. I moved to comedy, and I show how this is done in comedy with an analysis of Marivaux's journalism and his heroic comedic works, and show how Marivaux as well is focusing on the emotions, and he's adding even more detail and layers and sequences and phases to his characters and his reflection on emotions like love in his plays. And then chapter 6, I take on a subgenre that is entirely about emotion. There was a very popular wave of plays of comédie larmoyante, or tearful comedies, that were supposedly all about crying in comedy. And there were reports that people would cry, and there were tremendous emotional moments. And what I do here is I reconstitute a performance of this and show that there were a lot of processes of distancing as much as there were of absorption and other adhesion techniques. And we'll talk about that at the end today. And then in the conclusion, I run out of steam after 300 pages of talking about 17th and 18th century theater. But what I do is just provide a few vignettes of people in the 20th century who are writing about theater and emotion, people like Antonin Artaud and Brecht and Boal, and just to show that this idea of what kinds of emotions should happen during a theatrical performance is something that's far from settled, even as we move into the 20th century. Okay, so what we'll do now is I just want to show you a little bit of the work I was doing for that first chapter on theater phobia. And I'll show you a few quotes. We won't spend any real time on them, but just to see some of the interesting things that people said about theater and how dangerous and how horrible it was. And you can think of how these arguments might be transformed in a more positive light, but still giving them and keeping the power that's given to the theater in those conceptions of the theatrical event. So I went through, read all kinds of tracks about the just terrible things that people said about the theater. And my prize jewel from this, and where I spend the most time, is on Pierre Nicole's Traité de la Comédie. So Pierre Nicole is a Jansenist cleric in 17th century France. And without going into Jansenism anyway, I think Puritan side of the Catholic Church. But Ancien Régime is great for its paradoxes. Also, he is a professor and a teacher and a tutor, and he tutors some of the finest playwrights in the French canon, Jean Racine, for example. So there are these great paradoxes that are interesting for scholars of the Ancien Régime. So I'll show you just a few things that he says, and then what then is done with some of those things during the 18th century. So he's talking about actors here. And he says, those who represent the passion of love must necessarily be infected while they represent it. And they shouldn't think that they can erase from their minds the impression that they voluntarily excited. And they shouldn't think that the impression doesn't leave them greatly disposed to that passion that they so readily wanted to feel. And so some interesting things here, and just maybe leave aside the moral judgment of what's going on right now, but look at some of the mechanisms and the qualities of the emotions, these debates over acting. Do actors feel what they're trying to exhibit or represent, or do they have a more plastic idea of acting? Do the emotions in theater carry on post-performance? Is there a durability of emotions? And so he has a lot of things to say about that. He also will say that when plays excite this passion, they do not imprint the love that regulates the passion. At the same time, spectators only receive the impression of the passion and little or none of the regulation of the passion. So if you put this into a more modern, lexicon, think about this with a more modern vocabulary, you can see, it's sort of interesting that he's talking about certain qualifiers, sort of these sort of asignifying intensity of these events, but it lacks the sort of component that allows us to provide a frame, to insert it into a framework for any sort of what he would determine Christian way of living or a useful thing. It's just a sort of thing we feel, and we don't really know sort of what to do with it or how it works. He goes on then to point out the entire thing of theater in a rather holistic way. So in this way, theater by its own nature is a school, an exercise in vice, given that it's an art where one has to excite passions in oneself. What makes the danger of theater even greater, however, is that it banishes all of the possible remedies that might stop the evil impression it makes. The heart is softened by pleasure. The mind is occupied by exterior objects and completely intoxicated by the insanity it sees represented. By consequence, the mind is outside of a state of Christian vigilance, which is necessary to avoid temptation. I mean, just so many things there, and we won't spend any more time, but this sort of this holistic way that theater can hurt us, that it's completely overwhelming, that it affects us, of course, mentally, but also very physically. He goes on in a different part of this traité to talk about how theater's like eating spoiled meat. It tastes perfectly fine, and we only find out later how bad it was for us. And so he then says that plays do not only excite the passions, but they also teach a language of the passions, which means the art of showing them and making them appear in a delightful and ingenious manner. This is no small evil. I mean, you can imagine someone from a different moral take on theater thinking, yeah, I mean, this is really great. So the theater here is teaching people how to then, according to Nicole, sort of contaminate other people after their performance with the language and the way of being that they've learned during the theatrical performance. Really bad stuff. Okay, just to go back to the table of contents for a second. That was from, obviously, chapter 1, the big theater phobia chapter. In chapter 2, what happens is someone who's a very slippery character. He's a diplomat, and he's a spy, he's a philosopher, he's an art critic, he writes plays, he writes novels, he does all kinds of things. He writes a 900-page, like, everything on art. And he has interesting things to say. He agrees with theaterphobes that that emotion is so important to this theatrical event. And that's really the most important part of theater. But what he's going to do is he's going to completely change the nature of that emotional experience. And this is a quote that I always promise myself I'll never show people, because it gives me a headache just to read this quote. But I think I'll just draw attention. So he goes on. So he goes, painters and poets excite these artificial passions by presenting imitations of objects capable of exciting true passions in us. Because the impression that these imitations make on us is of the same nature as the object's impression imitated by the painter or the poet would be on us. Because the impression made by the imitation is only different from the imitated object's impression in that it is weaker, it must therefore excite in our mind a passion that resembles that which the imitated object would have excited. So there's some idea of we've created something that is like something else, and that's why this is okay. Or to go back to Nico, that's why this might not affect Christian vigilance or anything like that. He talks about a sort of cognitive frame that we walk into the theater with that sort of makes all that real harm disappear, and we have an ability to enjoy these emotional moments without sort of thinking that they're going to cause us any real harm. He goes on in a different way to talk about how these things don't penetrate our heart. These impressions don't penetrate our heart. They scrape the surface and they don't cause any real harm. So there's a lot of interesting mechanisms that are at play here. And so I go back again to the table of contents. In chapter 3, one of Jean-Baptiste Dubos's enemies in a debate between ancients and moderns, Dubos feels like playwrights at the time should just be imitating as much as possible Greek tragedy, because you could never do any better than Greek tragedy. Oudal de la Motte is completely of the opposite side of things. He goes, no, we live in the most glorious monarchy in Europe. We're the pinnacle of society. French tragedy, French comedy is the best art, and we can do it better now than they ever did it in the past. And so La Motte comes up with even more complex But he agrees, with Dubus that emotion is the most important. He agrees so much with Dubus that he goes, we don't need any of these rules that govern tragedy. We don't need rules. We don't need unities, any sort of Aristotelian dramatic theory or anything like that. We need emotion, but not just any sort of emotion, sentiment raisonnable. So these sentiments, but are also reasonable, and that have both a highly effective component and a highly thoughtful and mindful component. And so he lays that out in a book of theory in chapter 3. What's really interesting about him, though, is that he doesn't write a 900-page book on theory. His theoretical texts are mini sort of additions to his plays. And he sort of spells out, and he's very deliberate with what he's doing. He goes, I'm writing these theoretical texts to help playwrights understand that emotion is so important and how to use emotion in tragedies. And he goes, my lessons are not for people like Racine and Molière and Corneille. They're people who have no talent like me, and they can write great tragedies too. So there's a whole pedagogical component to this, and a very modesty or false modesty, I'm not sure which way he's going, but is an interesting way of presenting theory as well. That's very different than how theory is presented in some of the other authors at the time. In chapter 4, so one thing that Lamotte does is he says, there are very important emotions out there. And these emotions are cross-cutting, they're cross-generic. We don't care about the rules anymore. One of them is interest. Interest is the most important thing. If a play has interest, then you don't need any rules. You don't need to follow any special unities or anything like that. And so he writes a bunch of tragedies with this in mind. And so chapter 4 is all about those biblical and historical tragedies. Marivaux is very keen on Lamotte's plays, and he picks up on this idea that we can bring a really serious reflection on what emotion is, but into a genre that's not always viewed theoretically with the same seriousness. That would be comedy. But Marivaux does that. And so in his journalism, he details the different emotions that he sees among different Parisians and people outside of Paris as well. And what I argue is that he's incorporating all of these fine-grained details of these emotional valences into his characters. And he ultimately creates characters where emotion is key, even to the point of, to be modern, you need to be able to have a certain emotional register and also recognize the emotional needs and abilities of others. And I have a very close reading in chapter 5 of Le Triomphe de l'amour, the triumph of love. And I love any of these plays that are about emotions. They're very indicative of what I'm trying to talk about. And then finally in chapter 6, I take on a genre that's, it's sort of always looked down upon, because who wants to go see a comedy and then cry? That's the critique that's made against it in the 1730s. That's the critique that's made against it in 2010. It's not a genre that has done well in historiography. And the idea was always people would come into one of these plays and they would be intense tear sessions, and they'd be very sentimental. And so there's a lot of gendered arguments against these plays. And there's a lot of arguments that they're really just sort of bourgeois plays about money. And what I do is I reconstitute the performance. And so I reconstitute the performance of the play that supposedly launched this entire genre. Nivelle de la Chaussée's La Fausse Antipathie. So again, another play about emotion, La Fausse Antipathie, or false meanness or false antipathy. And what's really interesting about these plays, and what a lot of people don't understand or didn't know, and what I did not know before beginning this project, was that these plays were performed at the Comédie-Française, often with a performed prologue before the play. Then there's the play, say, La Fausse Antipathie, and then a performed critique or epilogue at the end. And so I look at these 3 plays that are all now called La Fausse Antipathie, and the emotional registers of these plays are so different. There's a play before a play that justifies the existence of the genre, and then the play after it sort of makes fun of it and critiques it in a way using a very Molière style of comedy. And so it just calls into question this idea that we have of these are intense cry sessions, or if they are, they can be, and also so many other things. They have convoluted plots. There's an incredible amount of cognitive energy that has to go into following one of the plots of these plays. And so there's a lot of mindful engagement in these plays, as well as emotional engagement. And that's sort of what they wanted to do. They wanted to do both with the same play. And I'm trying to sort of rehabilitate some of these plays that have always been looked down upon a little bit. In the conclusion, what I thought I would do, and I see that I am running out of time and I want to stick to what I said I would do. I've seen other people do this and I really like it. So I'm just going to read a little bit from my conclusion very briefly. Okay. So this journey has attempted to avoid more traveled paths in the history of literature. Instead of demonstrating a shift from one poetic movement to another, such as the change from neoclassical tragedy to the Enlightenment drame, I've attempted to ground poetic transformations in broader sociocultural environments, such as religious theaterphobia or the semiotic instability of the Regency. These are complex climates that altered formal elements of dramatic literature, but that also resignified the theater in society and boosted the role of emotional moments and understanding those emotional moments in the professional and personal lives of French subjects. While my study's impact is relatively modest due to its focus on one linguistic tradition's early modern past, this relational, affective, and practical strand in theatrical discourse remains a crucial component of theater and performance studies today. During the early Enlightenment, a handful of avant-garde dramatists and theorists injected new theories of emotion, cognition, and subjectivity into an emerging public sphere. This network of competing ideas, discourses, and power relations was characterized as much by surprising emotional moments of performance and spectatorship as by any rational, critical discussions of enlightenment. The diverse tensions and what at first seemed like a homogeneous political and social structure is what makes this period both frustrating and interesting to scholars and students of the old regime. If the Enlightenment was indeed a set of discourses, actions, and processes, an age of enlightenment rather than an enlightened age, it appears that writers during the period kept true to the Kantian claim by bringing to the forefront, but not forever resolving, the most complex questions of their day. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and thank you very much for being here tonight. I can't see you, but I appreciate you being here.
Okay, so now we'll turn to the Q&A session. And I, in fact, already have a couple of questions, as well as possible one of my own if we have time, but I think I'll give other people priority. So the first question starts off with a statement, fabulous presentation. Was there any relationship between theaterphobia and Catholic didactic theater in early colonial contexts?
That's a great question. I'm obviously not an expert on that situation at all, but I do know Jesuits, and anytime there are Jesuits, there's usually theater, and the most fantastic theatrical performances in schools around France during the 17th century and in the 18th century until the Jesuits are expelled are at Jesuit college. And those Jesuits went out into the world, and not just, of course, French Jesuits, but Jesuits from all over Europe. And I would imagine that any place you find Jesuits, you'll find theater teaching various things, whether it's teaching people Latin. There's a lot of theater that's pedagogical, a way of teaching Latin, a way of teaching other languages, and a way of teaching certain values as well. They're Jesuit theater, they're Jesuit plays that are about how to be nice to your sister. There are Jesuit plays about, how to respect your parents. They're all different ways that the Jesuits were involved in theaters. And since they were so involved in colonialization, I would imagine you'd find that as well.
I can't resist an anecdote about theater in a medieval colonial context. When the Teutonic Knights were overrunning the Baltics and rounding up people to Christianize them. In one case, they had a play to teach about the Bible, and when it came to a battle scene, the entire audience headed for the hills because they figured they were about to be massacred. So anyway, turning back to more relevant points, were there 17th or 18th century plays dealing with the lives of the saints, such as Saint Teresa of Avila, sort of equivalent to early medieval ones, I suppose one could ask?
Definitely. There's an entire canon of plays that are dedicated to saints. San Genesio, St. Thomas, there's an entire, I'd say the heyday of plays about saints in terms of, as France is concerned, would be the late 16th century and into the early part of the 17th century. There are tons and tons and tons of plays about saints, but also going into the 18th century and even up into the French Revolution. And there are 19th century plays about saints as well. I don't know offhand any plays about Saint Teresa though.
Okay. So again, a preface, thanks so much to Logan, Yolanda, and the Center for the Humanities for this. I was wondering if there were some expectations, rules, theories about what audiences should or should not do when attending a play, or if the theories were more towards playwriting and acting.
Well, there's a set of books about this. Actually, an author of a book, and he's coming to the University of Miami next week. Jeff Ravel, he wrote an entire book about spectator behavior. And there are a lot of prescriptions of how spectators should behave, but I think it's important to note that spectators misbehaved in general in a way that would be unfathomable, of course, now. Spectators in the parterre or in the pit, say, of the Comédie Française are standing, and there are fights, there are people having sex, there are people drinking, there are constantly complaints and police reports of the misbehavior of people. And there are different reforms at different times about how people should behave. And a lot of this changes with certain theoretical ideas surrounding the fourth wall and the importance of the fourth wall and the importance of separating the fiction on the stage from the audience and keeping away from that audience behavior. And so there are a tremendous amount of texts on that, and as well as theories. And Denis Diderot, one of the Enlightenment writers that I wrote about in my first book, would be the person to turn to for theories of how people should behave in theater, not in a sort of moral way, but in a way that he views them as they would most appreciate the theatrical experience.
Thanks. And thanks for a great presentation. What were the theaterphobes afraid that unregulated love would lead to? Prostitution? Sodomy?
Yes. All the things. No, I think that there are all kinds of theaterphobes, and they're in it for so many different reasons. There's a tract from a theaterphobe who's very concerned, for example, that theater is competing with the emotional moments that the church is proposing at the same time. And that by going to theater, love is a bad one, and lust, those are always talked about the most, but also just the act of going to the theater and feeling so much that these spectators don't have enough to feel things like post-confessional grace and the sort of mystery of Christ and all these things that the church is claiming that they should have these intense emotional reactions to. In terms of prostitution, of course, there's a direct link between the concern of prostitution and actresses. Actresses are always getting called on the carpet for being prostitutes, and many of them are, but in also as promoting others because other women would want to see them and all the attention they're getting, so leading to a sort of army of prostitutes among female spectators. And there's a lot of that in theaterphobic writing.
Next, could you talk a bit more about how you employ affect theory here? How do these writers conceive of what emotion is in either the theaterphobic or philic discourse?
Yeah, I definitely don't employ affect theory in any meaningful way, other than, one thing that's very interesting to me in affect theory, and I'm not an expert, is this debate between an unanalyzability of affect, or conceptualizing affect as an intensity, or asignifying something that is there, but we have problems talking about it, directing it, or understanding what it could do. And I think that way of thinking about affect is a similar way to some of the theaterphobes were thinking about whatever you want to call what's happening in the theatrical event. It's part of that unanalyzability of it and that unbridledness to it, that it is so dangerous, and the potential of it, whether you're talking about a political potential of it or a sort of antisocial potential of it, and the way that they can't describe where it's going to go or if it's going to lead to a sort of Christian ending. That's what's so problematic. That's kind of the way I'm looking at affect theory here, but also a response from maybe someone with a more cognitive approach to the emotions who critiques affect theory for some of those gaps. Someone like Ruth Lays, who wrote a lot about affect theory, and those gaps of unanalyzability make it difficult to say anything at all about it and to use it in sort of some meaningful way, say dramaturgically or theoretically in her work.
I've been perhaps somewhat rudely skipping all the names of the people asking questions.
It's all good MLL people, so I know them all. They'll follow up.
For the next couple ones, I'll may give the names because they're close to your field. Barbara Roshinsky has very clear and exciting talk, question, and a comment. I see that your work bridges the traditional line between centuries. Do you see a tipping point in moving from the anti-theater discourse of the 17th century and the new ideas of the 18th, or is it a gradual evolution?
It's great to have a question from a 17th, and Barbara, it's been so long since I've seen you. It's nice to know that you're here tonight. I think, I don't think that there's the way I'm reading, say, Dubus is responding to theaterphobes, it's not totally correct. I mean, there are a lot of responses to theaterphobes in the 17th century. Without going too much into that, to answer your question, I would say, I think that the death of Louis XIV is kind of interesting. So if you want to talk about a tipping point or something that happens that produces a lot of new theories of emotions, an actual moment, but I do see a sort of gradual process that's happening with different ideas that are being circulated in the early 18th century between England, the Low Countries, and France, and a possible sort of breaking point or tipping point in the death of Louis XIV.
Thanks. Next, from Anne Cruz, were the theaterphobes anti-classical as well? Think of the classical purpose of catharsis, which would need emotions to reach a purgation of emotions.
Yeah, I think that most of the theaterphobes thought catharsis was just a total hoax. They thought it was absolute nonsense, and they didn't understand how it worked or how it would work, and they thought it was for the defenders of the theater in the 17th century. They were using catharsis as a way to absolve themselves of the real harm of theater. And so I think that you're right there is an anti-classical approach. There's a certain, these are pagans, these people are doing horrible things. Why would you want to be like them? And there's also a deep suspicion of how catharsis might ever work.
Okay, next, moving on. Excellent presentation. Question, were there religious playwrights that did not condemn the emotions raised by theater?
Oh, definitely. There are a tremendous amount of religious playwrights who viewed theater as the most creative and engaging way to promote religious values. There are playwrights who, again, are writing about martyrs and saints and the importance of the church, all of the playwrights that I could possibly mention have probably written on a religious theme. Corneille, Racine, Lamotte, the people from my corpus as well. The whole sort of Jesuit endeavor in the 17th century compared to, say, Jansenists was all about using the theater for religious purposes.
Next, could you share your most surprising or rewarding discovery through this research writing of the book?
Jess, thanks for being here, Jess. That's a tough question. Surprising. I mean, I think theaterphobia is sort of surprising, not the sense that a bunch of people hated theater, but they have some really interesting things to say about the power of performance, and they say it's a bad power, but what they say, they have a lot of faith in what theater can do, which is pretty interesting. I think another interesting part was just figuring out that, like, comédie larmoyante, which are these tearful comedies that, you think they're very like morose and very down. There's like a funny play that's performed right before it. And so it made me think about, I've studied French theater for, I don't know, now 15 years. And I knew, like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that, like, it totally changes my idea of, like, how people felt during a performance.
Next, did the idea of theaterphobia extend also to French literature at that time?
Yeah, so would a theaterphobe not like a novel or something like that? Definitely. And so I think that theater is particularly attacked because of the audiovisual qualities of theater, the performance qualities of theater, seeing like real young people in love and young unmarried women doing things. I mean, that part is very dangerous to theaterphobes, but novels are very dangerous as well. And novels, there's an interesting gender component, of course, if you know the history of the novel, and that's, novels are bad because, only women read novels, not true. And women will be corrupted by this sort of thing, because these, they'll all become Madame Bovary is basically the idea. But you can see how it works in novels, in poetry, in all different genres.
Okay, back to Barbara. In the 17th century science of mind, for instance, Descartes and Malebranche, external stimuli were thought to create literal impressions in the brain. So no wonder theater could be considered both powerful and dangerous. When those theories lost favor and vocabulary changed, might that have had an effect on attitude toward theater?
Yeah, that's great. And I didn't get into that, but I would encourage you to read that, at least that first chapter, where I talk about one thing that makes, say, Pierre Nicole's traité so powerful is that he's reading Descartes. And then later, someone like Bossuet reading Malebranche and understanding how, say, in a Malebranchian metaphysics, how that occasionalist principle could be so dangerous in the theater, but sort of from a different, not the grace of God that sort of comes upon us, but unintended consequences of the theatrical performance. And this is often used in condemnations of even religious dramas and martyr plays. And these plays make us into such an emotional state that we don't know what's going to happen to it. And I think there's a lot of reflection on both of those authors. In the 18th century, I think a lot of the people are still sort of committed to Descartes. I mean, Descartes proposes a very rigorous way of thinking about things. But yeah, as you move into sort of the later philosophe stuff with Diderot and people like that, they're definitely moving away of Descartes, and they can talk about emotion in a way that's totally different from any of the people in my corpus.
And a question from another early modernist, my predecessor, Mihoko Suzuki. Did the playwrights who also wrote novels, like Marivaux, theorize the affective difference between theater and novels, the different effects of the visual and the imaginative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Marivaux is a good example. Marivaux writing not only novels and theater, but also a lot of journalism. And so I guess I would have to think about the novel question a bit, because I see a lot of what Marivaux is trying to do in his theater and also in his novels. I think there are a lot of similarities, but in his journalism, he does remark of certain limits of theater, of what theater can't do. Theater could not show the interiority of this person or of this thing happening that maybe a novel could. And so I think Marivaux is, I think, one of the most unrecognized philosophers, actually, of the 18th century. And he's really thinking about how thought operates. And he does make claims that say, in journalism, we can discover different ways and different motivations behind people, but in theater, we can try to map that out, but we need to be more obvious. We need to do different things. And so he is looking across these different genres, but I'd have to look at he also has a lot of theoretical tracks on the novel, and I just don't know those well enough.
And a question from Yolanda. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of emotions? When I think about the Enlightenment period, emotions seem to be secondary to the rational. So I'm curious about the notions of passion and emotion that are depicted in the texts that you analyze. How are emotions different from the way we conceive them now?
Yeah, that's great. And actually, that's sort of one of the big points I probably should have made at the beginning, that this book is showing that, like, it's not the age of reason. Like, it's not, the Enlightenment is not just about reason and rationality, and that emotion is such an important component of it. So there's there's a lot of things to say about the history of emotions in the 18th century, usually viewed as such an important century for discovering that history. I think the only thing I'll mention in regards to that is that what's unique about some of the authors that I'm talking about is a certain ability to combine, if you want to call them cognitive and affective processes at the same time, into one thing. And I think that sort of history of the thoughtful parts of highly emotional moments, that part has been sort of erased or not looked at enough in terms of the age of reason and these ideas of thinking is who we are and that. So I think it's the I don't want to call them rational, but just the thinking components of emotion is what is so important to my corpus, and what I hope to show in the history of emotions was a thing that was really happening, not just in philosophy, but in theater at the time.
And we actually have time for for my main question, which is, I'm familiar from the 16th century England with the Puritan attacks on the theater and the response of playwrights like Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare and putting Puritans in their plays. Obviously, you're dealing with a little bit later period, but were there similar debates in England? Did Protestantism versus Catholicism make a difference? Or were they talking along the same lines despite the confessional differences?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a religious historian, so it's tricky, yeah. And I'm not a historian of England, but it is interesting to look. And Protestants in France are a little bit quieter for obvious reasons. But there are Protestant tracts against theater, and some of them are coming and published in Amsterdam, and some of them are published in England. And there's a very vocal minority of writers who I think, I'd have to look at sort of the status of their ability to weigh in. I get the impression there's a lot of expatriated writers talking about theater in general. I don't see a tremendous pro-theater argument from Protestant writers in France, which makes me sort of want to talk about Rousseau, but it's a very different thing. But there is a strong tradition of theater phobia that's linked to Protestantism or slightly near Protestantism that is also very suspect of the monarchy. And so I think Jansenism, which is what's interesting about it, is they're playing dangerously close, with their own acceptance into the Roman Catholic Church. And that is also where the highest degree of intensity against the theater exists in France. And then this tradition, if you follow it into a more safe time for Protestants in France, that theaterphobic tradition maintains some value in that history.
Thanks. One of the things I want to figure out how to do myself in my own presentations is how to answer questions more clearly, but also concisely. And so you've sort of formed a model here of getting your way with good answers through a lot of questions, which means even though
I can write them a more convoluted and long email, because I was very short on some of those answers as well, because I just didn't know the answer.
I think there's more to it than that. But in any case, great question and answer session with lots of interest, obviously, which I think reflects the great interest of the talk itself. And so I want to thank you for giving such a great presentation, the audience for attending in the evening at the end of a very long academic year. And I'll finish by, on behalf of the audience, giving some applause for a great talk.
Thank you.